Let us continue with our analysis of Thomas Gray's Elegy written in a country churchyard. We are almost at the end of this long poem, and we'll be reading the epitaph in this lecture. But before we continue with the poem, let me tell you something about the epitaph. An epitaph is a short piece of writing or a poem about a dead person, especially one written on their gravestone, tombstone, that is the stone over the place where someone is buried. It is a short text honoring a deceased person. Some epitaphs are specified by the persons themselves before their death, while others are chosen by those responsible for the burial. An epitaph may be written in prose or in verse. Poets have been known to compose their own epitaphs prior to their death, as did William Shakespeare. Most epitaphs are brief records of the family and perhaps the career of the deceased, often with a common expression of love or respect. But there are some that are more ambitious. From the Renaissance to the 19th century in Western culture, epitaphs for notable people became increasingly lengthy and pompous descriptions of their family origins, career, virtues, and immediate family, and often written in or inscribed in Latin. Some epitaphs are quotes from holy texts or aphorisms. Some record achievements, and nearly all, except for the unknown, note name, year or date of birth and death, and many list family members and the relationship of the deceased to them. An epitaph or a gravestone inscription serves many purposes. Translated from Greek to mean upon a tomb, epitaphs can identify the deceased, summarize an entire life or profession, or express tributes from mourners left behind. Memorable epitaphs can even bring a final smile or tear to those left behind. The epitaph at the end of Gray's Elegy is in continuity with stanzas 24th and 29th, where a village rustic describes the habits of the poet himself. And as I've already mentioned, that the next three stanzas are the epitaph on Gray's tomb, where another person is looking at the speaker's or the poet's death in a philosophical contemplation of mortality, just as the speaker himself did throughout the context of the poem. In a way, it is actually the poet imagining his own tombstone and the epitaph on it. Let us read the epitaph before I talk more about it. So, the poet says, or the speaker says, "Here rests his head upon the lap of earth, a youth to fortune and to fame unknown. Fair signs frowned not on his humble birth, and melancholy marked him for her own. Large was his bounty, and his soul sincere. Heaven did a recompense as largely send. He gave to misery all he had, a tear he gained from heaven. 'Twas all he wished, a friend. No further seek his merits to disclose, or draw his frailties from their dread abode. There they alike in trembling hope repose, the bosom of his Father and his God." So here The poet says, here rests his head upon the lap of earth. Here means at this spot rests his head, is buried. Lap of earth, the earth is often called Mother Earth because it sustains human life. And he is lying buried here as if it is resting, as if he is resting in his mother's arms. A youth to fortune and to fame unknown. A young man, poor and obscure, unknown. Fair. Fair stands for beautiful, but here it is used for science. That is, science is personified, so that it almost stands for the goddess of knowledge. Frowned not, looked favorably upon. Now it is a sort of a double negative for smiled. On his humble birth, on him, in spite of his humble birth, smiled on him in spite of his humble birth. Melancholy marked him for her own. Melancholy or sadness, again personified here, set her mark on him to show that he belonged to her. It means that he was a man of a naturally morose disposition, and it is said that this was true of Gray. And melancholy marked him for her own child. The next stanza, large was his bounty. Large was his bounty, the poet's bounty, generous. Soul, and his soul sincere. His character was sincere, was serious, was unaffected. Heaven did a recompense as largely send. Heaven represents God. Recompense, reward. As large as his generosity. He gave to misery all he had. Misery, the wretched. All he had, a tear, everything which he possessed. That is, with a tear of sympathy. Gained from heaven. He received from God as a reward of his generosity, as a reward of his sympathy. It was all he wished. That was his only desire. His wish in life was not to grow wealthy or famous, but to get a true friend. And this true friend he did get. Probably this true friend was God. No father seek his merits to disclose. No further, not in greater detail. Seek his, try his, disclose, enumerate, draw out his frailties, bring out his frailties, his defects, their dread abode, the awful place where now they rest. There, on the bosom of God, they, his merits, alike, equally with the frailties, in trembling hope, in hope mixed with fear, the bosom of his Father and his God, repose, rest. So what the poet is saying is that in this grave, the speaker is telling that is, in this grave lies a young man who was poor and obscure, but fairly educated, but he was of a morose disposition. He was very generous and sincere because he gave away to the wretched all he had, and all he had was sympathy. And the Elegy is an example of that. He received from God a reward as great as his generosity had been large, namely a true friend, and that was the only wish of his life. It is no use enumerating his good qualities and defects, for both are in the hands of God, who may approve or disapprove of them as he pleases. So the inscription enumerating his qualities and showing that the poet identifies with all the humble, unknown souls lying in the country churchyard. He is not setting himself above them, but states that he is equally obscure. Like them, he has not been born to fortune, that he too was of humble birth. But he, unlike the simple village folk, was no stranger to knowledge or science in spite of his humble origins. He was a scholar and a poet. But alas, he was sometimes depressed, melancholic, or deeply thoughtful and sad. He, however, asks to be remembered as generous and sincere. And he says that heaven paid him back for these good qualities as he found a friend, a kindred uh, spirit, he says. The speaker is probably referring to his friend Richard West, who died in 1742 um, and may have occasioned the writing of the poem. So the speaker concludes by cautioning the reader not to praise him any further, and that his frailties be buried with him like his virtues. He lies in peace. The word dread is in the sense of awesome. He rests in God's protection, and the epitaph marks his grave, which is the final place of rest. The poem Elegy, written in a country churchyard, is then not only for the common man, but for the speaker himself too, as he wishes to be identified not with the great and the famous, but with the simple and humble common people. It is ironic, however, as uh, he became famous, uh, he became a famous poet, and the elegy remains one of his most admired works. So, uh, we have done the analysis of the whole elegy, and I'll be doing uh, a, a critical appreciation of sorts in the next lecture, and we'll also talk about the elegy. Now, what is an elegy in detail? So, go through the poem as a whole and listen to the lectures, and I hope you're able to understand what the poet is trying to do in the poem. Thank you.